everyone. Welcome to this session at the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Dr. Becky Millar, and I'm an associate lecturer here at the University of York. I research philosophy, and particularly the philosophy of perception and the philosophy of emotion. And for the past few years, two of my main research areas have been the philosophy of smell and the philosophy of grief and loss. So I'm very happy to chair this session about the loss of the sense of smell today. Now to introduce our speakers for today, we have Paola Totaro and Robert Wainwright here with us. Paola Totaro is an award-winning news reporter, editor, and former president of the Foreign Press Association in London. She has written for the New York Times, The Guardian, The Independent, the Sydney Morning Herald, and The Australian. Robert Wainwright is a prize-winning Australian author and journalist. His non-fiction titles include the international bestseller Sheila and the Maverick Mountaineer, which won the Times Biography of the Year at the 2017 British Sport Book Awards. Today, Paola and Robert will be showing us how losing our sense of smell can shape our world and how the global pandemic transformed our understanding of this mysterious sense. So to start things off, Paola, could you maybe tell us a little bit about how you came to write on the scent and why you decided to turn this experience of yours into a journalistic endeavour?
Thank you, Becky, and hello to everybody who's listening. Well, it began obviously with COVID. I was a journalist. I was covering this very strange and mysterious disease that we'd heard about was about to envelop the world, and I had been covering it in Italy, where the first lockdowns occurred. And on March 27, I was at home, I was washing my hands, and I went to use a very fragrant hand moisturizer and couldn't smell it. It was one of my favorite things, couldn't smell it, went for perfumes, couldn't smell it, finally ended up putting my nose in a bottle of toilet bleach, and there was nothing. And it was almost like a light turning off. It was sudden, and I then knew, because I had been reporting the first sort of COVID cases in Italy, that this was something that was anecdotal, that doctors were reporting that people were coming in with this sudden loss of smell. And so that began my desire as a journalist to report on what was happening. And then obviously we saw, as the pandemic continued to envelop the world, that there was a pandemic of anosmia, which is the loss of smell.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is an experience that a lot of people had during the pandemic, obviously, and I imagine a very disconcerting one. Can you maybe go into a little bit more detail about what it was actually like to suddenly lose your sense of smell like that? What were the kind of most salient features of that experience to you?
Well, in the moment that it happened, I remember feeling almost as if I was in an elevator that was dropping. It was this sense of absolute unanchoring of moorings. Something that I rely on. I'm very smell oriented. When I go for a walk with a dog, I put my nose in every flower. I drive my husband mad with stopping and smelling. I love food. I'm Italian, so I have a great sort of passion in flavors. And, from that moment, I realized that this whole dimension of life had ended. And as the days unfolded, it really felt like, the world had gone from color to gray. Walks weren't the same. I couldn't taste anything. Of course, I didn't know at the time that my understanding at the time was that we taste with our tongues. Well, I would learn later that we do taste with our tongues, the 5 basic things: bitter, sweet, etc., etc. But flavor, all that nuance, the joy of cinnamon, or the kind of wafty sense of a spice, nothing. There was absolutely nothing. And we're in lockdown, and for many of us, a drink at the end of the day and alcohol at the end of the day sort of lifted our spirits, and I couldn't. Red wine tasted like salty water. It was really horrible, and it went on and on. And at that point, of course, we knew nothing. We just didn't know whether it would come back. And I just thought, well, am I going to live like this for the rest of my life? And it really, at one point, it was very depressing, to be honest, really depressing.
Yeah, I can imagine it must have been. I want to ask you about lots of aspects of that, but just in case people at home aren't aware of the link between smell perception and flavour, could you maybe say a little bit more about what you kind of discovered about the relationship between flavour and smell while you were writing the book?
Well, I think, you know, one of the extraordinary things about this whole journey was how much I learned. As I say, I thought that our tongues were responsible for our joy in food, for the hedonic sort of value of food. And in actual fact, that's not true, because all we really perceive with our tongues are salty, sweet, bitter, umami, and I always forget the fifth one. Somebody will fill me in. Whereas flavour requires the chewing of food. And then as the food is chewed and becomes macerated, I suppose, it releases molecules of odour, and they go up through the back of your throat into the nose, and that's where the nose neurons and the whole sort of scaffolding and olfactory system take over and give you those nuanced, you know, flavours that make life such a joy. I had no idea. And in fact, while I was researching, one of the most incredibly interesting experiments that a professor of philosophy actually made me do was put a peg on my nose, and first of all, to take say an orange jelly bean, put it in your mouth with the peg on your nose, and it tastes sweet. That's all you can taste. You take the peg off and suddenly orange shoots through your head. I had no idea. And actually, if anyone's out in the audience and have some jelly beans, try that experiment, because it's really quite mind-boggling.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, things like eating meals together, being in the same environment together are really important aspects of our kind of relationships with others as well. So I'd like to just like ask Robert as well what your experience was like as like the partner of someone who was going through this sudden loss of the capacity to both taste and smell during this time. So could you maybe say a little bit, Robert, about what this was like for you as well?
I became the designated nose for this sort of period, if you will. And I mean, it was funny in places like you know, if I cook, Paola, who's upstairs, doesn't like the smell of meat, for example, wafting up, but she couldn't smell it. But it was an interesting relationship as this went on. But I mean, I could see the distress and the change, and our conversations at dinner would be about whether the food was right, whether you could taste the basil, for example, and she was confused, and you could see the loss. So it was about assuring her that things were okay, that she wasn't going mad about what was happening to her. It was interesting with our dog walks, which Paola referenced. I get slightly frustrated because our dog always wants to stop and smell things. And when Paola had anosmia, she was exactly the same. She'd stick her head in every single jasmine bush walking down the street. So it wasn't really a walk, it was more a pause. But it was, I mean, it went on for 18 months. So I sort of describe her experience toward the end as sort of almost like pixelation on a television screen where, you know, suddenly it goes a little bit wonky. And even up until recently, there are moments where Paola is uncertain about smell. You know, now she can smell things, but the memory of some things has to be tested. She has to think consciously about what they are. So the impact is widespread and it's psychological, I think. But thankfully, it's worked its way through.
Yeah, thank goodness.
I think to add to that, you know, the other side is that, you know, we in normal life, you know, we go to the gym and we're aware that we need a shower, for example, or, you know, all these things that are sort of in the background of the sense of smell. And when it goes, you don't really have a sense of yourself either. So I think one of the things that probably drove him nuts was, you know, oh God, do I smell? You're constantly worried about, you know, what's around you that you can't perceive. So that was the other sort of unpleasant side, if you like.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can really sense this kind of like this loss of trust that you experienced in your own like capacities and in like just this sense of kind of not knowing what whether you smelled, whether the environment smelled, and so on. It's very interesting. And the other thing that I found really interesting in this area from your book was that it wasn't just a matter of anosmia, but also kind of smell distortions as well. And that sounds kind of particularly disconcerting. Can you maybe say a little bit about that as well?
Well, I was very lucky in that I suffered what they call smell locks, I suppose. So when I was recovering, and we now know what happens in the nose post-COVID as it's recovering, that the scaffolding cells that are affected by the virus are the ones that are destroyed by the virus. So it's a little bit like a keyboard that's thrown on the floor. You've got all the letters, but you can't actually operate it. And so those sort of functions have to return. So I had smell lock and I smelled smoke for months and months, a couple of months where I just was constantly worrying that the house was on fire, or, that there was a tea towel on the stove. And so poor old Robert had to check all the time. But a lot of other people had a terrible response. And we now know this is called parosmia, part of the recovery process. So generally good news, but at the time we didn't know. But they would be smelling, even water would make them ill. Smells of, they describe it across the board as corpses, sewage, garbage rotting, the tip. Terrible distortions of lovely smells that for most people you enjoy, but for a period of time are completely confused. And that's what we call parosmia. And then there are other people that had another thing called phantosmia, where they are imagining a smell. So parosmia is a distorted smell where there is a source, whereas phantosmia is literally like a smell hallucination, if you like. In other words, you're smelling something, but there's no stimulus. So I think for many, many people, and there's many people still suffering. There's charities in the UK, Absent and Fifth Sense, that work with people with olfactory issues, and they still are dealing with so many people that are unable to eat and nauseated, losing weight, can't cook, just because of this sort of awful recovery process.
I think somebody just asked a question about repeating the jelly bean test, if Paola wants to.
Someone's just asking about explaining the jelly bean experiment. I guess they want to try it out for themselves.
Well, just grab a nose peg, or just literally hold your nose. No, hang on. First of all, get some jelly beans. Choose a flavour. Hold your nose. Put the jelly bean in your mouth with your nose pegged. Chew it till it's almost about to be swallowed, then let go. And you will have this remarkable experience. I promise you. And then you want to do it at parties, as I did for a long time.
So one of the things that comes through in your book is that the sense of smell has been very kind of undervalued in general by people. People tend to kind of think of it as like the least important sense or something like that. So I wonder if you could maybe say a little bit about that, what your perspective on that issue is, and whether it's changed after your own experiences.
Look, it has been called by many of the scientists that I spoke to, and particularly one in particular who was wonderful, who's a philosopher, in fact, and she sort of dubbed it the Cinderella of the senses. And I think that's true. Having spent a year researching it, I don't think that the same level of resources, attention, intellectual attention, scientific attention has been placed on this sense. And I suppose in a way, it appears to be the most dispensable, because in the end, let's face it, if we were to lose a sense, we would probably not want to lose our hearing or sight, because the capacity to do many things is so terribly reduced. And in fact, there was a very interesting vox pop that was done with teenagers who were asked, would you rather lose your mobile phone or your sense of smell? And they all said sense of smell. But, it's not till you lose it that you understand how important it is, and how important it is for everything from safety to, for the fact that I nearly burnt a tea towel and burnt the house down, right through to the fact that it's the earliest of the senses that sort of emerged in single cell animals. And it's very important, to us humans still across the board for, just warning us. Who doesn't make a cup of tea, screw the top off the milk and smell it first? We all do that because we're wired to look after our health, and smell is a sentinel. So my understanding of how important it was just gained every day as I understood what it does. We constantly smell. We even know our own smells. We know the smells. We're familiar with the smells of our children. There's sort of quite important evolutionary and behavioral studies that have been done about smell and maternal bonding. Some of the experiments that I saw were fascinating, and the importance of smell for the lactating infant in mammals right across the spectrum. So very underestimated, under-resourced, and really deserves much more spotlight, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I found the discussion in your book about the role of smell and maternal bonding very interesting, and the ways that even kind of in utero, the like tastes that the mother experiences kind of get passed on to the infant. Can you tell the audience a little bit about that? I found that really fascinating.
Well, I mean, that was an area that I could have written another book about. I was so fascinated. Every time I sort of told friends about it, they'd go, "Oh my God, that's amazing." I mean, in evolutionary terms, it was the first sense that developed in single cell animals. In humans and mammals, it's the first sense that develops in utero. And so what they've shown is that there's a huge amount of studies, and generally done with rats, with rabbits. But the importance of, once the baby is emerged from the womb, the smell of the milk, the particular glands around the areola of the nipple that appear in humans, we really don't know what they were for, but we're now starting to understand that actually they're solely as sort of guides for the infant to come to the lactating breath. In utero with humans, they've done some fascinating experiments where mothers ate fennel, for example, aniseed. It's a really strong smell, something that generally a child sort of, you would think, acclimatizes to. It's not a smell that they immediately love. The mothers that ate aniseed regularly in these groups, the baby then literally within minutes of birth would turn its head towards the smell of aniseed. So not just the milk, but also this fennel smell. So it is an inordinately powerful thing, that is with us from the earliest weeks of gestation, and clearly is terribly important throughout life.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think you talk about this in the book, but just out of curiosity, I was wondering if there'd been any research into congenital anosmia and whether or not that impacted the relationship between mother and baby, if they couldn't kind of have that detection of the maternal breast milk odors and so on. I don't know if you've come across anything.
Gosh, that's really interesting, and I think some work has been done, but I can't answer that because I spoke to lots of congenitally anosmic people and had my mind open to so many things, including the Spanish philosopher who sort of talked about perceptions of space. But in terms of, maternal bonding, that's really very interesting. So I probably a question I should have asked, Becky.
Well, maybe, actually, this is a question for both of you, but I was wondering if you could perhaps say a bit more about what you learned from the people that you spoke to and what you found kind of most interesting about their experiences.
I mean, look, I think I learned so much, and I spoke to people that had anosmia through a traumatic brain injury. I spoke to people that had congenital anosmia. I spoke to people that got it through a virus, so across the board, and their experiences were all different. But I think the one that remained with me, and I still think about a lot, is a Spanish philosopher called Maria Tafalla, and she has done a lot of work in this because she was born anosmic and has written quite extensively about her experience. And what, for example, she pointed out to me that if you're in the tube, let's say, or in a stuffy room, you have a sense of enclosed space, don't you? You feel like you are kind of, oppressed a bit. So, and that comes through the smell of, smelly socks or sweaty people in the tube. It comes through the sense of smell. if you don't have a sense of smell, you don't have that perception of being, in a stuffy, enclosed space. I had never thought of that. Equally, if you're driving along, you're going to the beach, and you suddenly get that lovely whiff of brine, of salty, fresh air, and you can't see the water, but it's across the horizon or across the next hill. If you don't have a sense of smell, that kind of sense of space and what might be coming, you don't have that. To me, they were just things I'd never thought of. I mean, who would perceive or think about that? The same, she talked very eloquently about looking at a cherry blossom tree. I mean, she says that she looks at cherry blossom tree and she can see the beauty of it, the bees, the movement of the wind, etc. But there is clearly something missing. But if you've never had it, is it missing? So, we talked about that kind of conundrum. And smell, because nobody has really great language for expressing smells, they're always expressed with visual terms like, what does this rose smell? That's a rosy smell or a lemony smell, or that in itself is really interesting, the language of smells. So I think for me, it was the perception things about smell that I really went away with and keep thinking about now.
Yeah, thank you. That is really interesting. The language thing certainly seems like we just use kind of words for the source of the smell rather than describing the smell itself. Robert, what did you find most interesting?
Well, one of my tasks was to find moments in history or people, current and former, who were anosmic. And I found the most fascinating was William Wordsworth, who, of course, wrote about daffodils and wrote about spring, the great lyrical poet. Everybody sort of knows vaguely I Want to Blow Me as a Cloud, which is about his experience walking through a field of daffodils. But he could never smell. He was born anosmic. We know that when we had a look at it because his nephew, who was the Bishop of Lincoln, I think, Lincolnshire, had many conversations with him, and also his great friend Robert Southey, the poet laureate, observed him and had conversations over the years. And it was also fascinating that Wordsworth was a very poor eater. So Southey loved his food, but in fact Wordsworth didn't. And he was a meagre eater and he didn't have flavour. But they weren't to know that. But I actually was able to look at the 6 volumes of Wordsworth's work because it's been digitised, and I looked through the various words that he would use to describe smell, and almost all of them were sweet. So he had no sense of smell apart from what he was told by others. So a man of words had very few words about aromas because he didn't experience them. We also had a more contemporary example, which is a very, very tragic story of an Australian musician. Many people might remember Michael Hutchins from rock group In Excess. And his experience was one of a traumatic brain injury when he got into a fight in the streets of Copenhagen back in the early 90s and struck his head and had permanent damage to the frontal lobes, which severed his olfactory neurons. And his character changed. He became depressed and angry. I mean, he was a very sensory person anyway. In fact, there was a documentary of his death because he committed suicide years later. And it's since been said that most likely the reason for this and the depression was this loss of smell and the change of lifestyle. And it was commented on by all his friends and family and band colleagues. So those sorts of experiences were fascinating to sort of see. Stevie Wonder, not only blind, but he lost his sense of smell for a time after a traffic accident. There's a number of sort of examples. We met the very funny, amazing sort of woman in London, Louise Woolham, who was a perfume blogger, very successful blog, and she didn't get COVID. She got a heavy cold a few years ago and lost her sense of smell. So if you can imagine somebody who smells for a living had suddenly lost that capacity. And hearing her story and how she trained herself through the 400 bottles of perfume that she had lying around the house and teaching herself how to smell again was these are wonderful stories that sort of humanise this whole a very scientific book. So yes, there was a number of examples.
Fascinating, thank you. I was really curious about the case of kind of retraining yourself to be able to smell again after experiencing anosmia. And it seemed from the book like this is kind of considered to be the best kind of way of approaching anosmia. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit more about that and what this kind of smell training consists of.
Yeah, look, it's very interesting because in a way, the pandemic of anosmia in the wake of COVID meant that this sort of small series of experiments that was being led by Professor who's seen as the grandfather of olfaction science, Thomas Hummel in Dresden, meant that it could be, spread across the world and basically have a litmus test globally for people to test this. But it's been seen that in anosmia, twice daily, sort of gentle sniffing and very mindful image making or thinking about the smell appears to speed up and help the recovery process. So obviously there is the molecular business that happens at the top of the nose where smell molecules are taken in and then brought back into the brain. But then there is the computation, if you like, that occurs. And so this link between sniffing, being mindful about what you're sniffing and remembering the smell that you were familiar with seems to help the reconnection process. And in some ways, it kind of makes sense because we know with strokes, for example, neuroplasticity, the fact the brain has the capacity to regenerate or to compensate more than regenerate. So it compensates in other ways. And so it really does seem to be now we're getting much longer studies over a longer period of time that smell training really does work. You have to be really consistent. You'd have to do it every day as you would with the gym, and you have to do it with familiar smells. All over the world, people have different smells culturally that are familiar to them. So in Japan, somebody doing smell training would probably, smell something different to what I might, or in Italy or in America. But it does seem to be very, very helpful. And the truth is that particularly with anosmia in viruses, the reality is that it's time. And these scaffolding cells do regenerate, but they take a long, long time. And I suppose the good news with COVID is that they used to say that if you didn't get your sense of smell back after a year, pretty much, you could pretty much say goodbye. We now know we're at the 3-year mark and some people are still recovering. So there's lots of hope to be had still. So if anyone's out there and has lost their sense of smell, keep training.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, this seems like it's kind of good news in a way for people with anosmia in that the COVID-19 pandemic has kind of created this increase of interest in this subject. Can you maybe say a little bit more about that and your perspective on how kind of the global pandemic has changed the research that's going into anosmia and other kind of smell disruption?
Well, I mean, I think that for the Cinderella of smells, the Cinderella of senses, COVID was the silver lining, really, because ultimately it was clear that it became a symptom. Sadly, in the UK, for example, it didn't actually get put on the symptoms list very quickly. It took us till May, which is another part of the book and another story. But what it did was concentrate global scientific attention on finding how it is that we lose our sense of smell. And so all of a sudden there were laboratories all over the world, US, Europe, UK, with olfactory scientists, flavour scientists, people really looking at this sense that had not been looked at properly. And of course, nowhere else have we had the capacity with literally millions of patients, because people were reporting to, for example, the charity in the UK, Absent. They had about 1,500 members prior to COVID, and by the first month after lockdown, it just exploded. And so all of a sudden there was this huge list, group of patients reporting their symptoms, being able to report their experiences. Doctors were able to tap into these resources, and I think we're still seeing the benefits now. I don't think there's any doubt that there's never been a moment in history when sense has been so studied and so resourced. Let's just hope that it continues.
Yeah, let's hope so. As you point out in the book, I mean, it seems like loss of the sense of smell can be a symptom of various different disorders. You talk about Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So hopefully this research will serve to kind of help people in those positions as well. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think that's a really important point that you raise, and that is that there are some neurological diseases where the loss of the sense of smell can occur up to 10 years before the other symptoms occur. So, for example, with Parkinson's, if the quicker you go on to Parkinson's medication, the greater the quality of life, the greater length of life, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully GPs at the very much at the coalface will start to take the loss of sense of smell a little more seriously, because it's not just a cold and you'll get on with it. Actually, if it hasn't occurred with something else, i.e. a cold or COVID, etc., it should be looked at, it should be investigated. It's the same with Alzheimer's, unfortunately. It's quite often a first symptom. Now, that doesn't mean anybody needs to panic, because obviously it's rare, but at the same time, it is a very important canary in the mine for other, and who knows what other things we might find that it indicates.
Yeah, I mean, it seems mad how little attention has actually been given to the sense of smell, given that it can be so indicative of these kinds of conditions. So, yeah, I found that a really important point that you make in your book. Regarding the pandemic, the other thing I found quite interesting was the fact that you actually managed to conduct this research at all. Since you obviously kind of were going and speaking to people and having to kind of visit labs and stuff while navigating all of the lockdowns and so on. So can you maybe explain a bit about the kind of practicalities of how you actually went about doing this research?
Well, I mean, the minute we were allowed to travel, I was off. But prior to that, I was really lucky. And I'm really lucky also because it's a small area, olfactory science and perception of the senses. And all the scientists globally, the top minds in this area, were all frustrated and going mad because they couldn't work, they couldn't get to their laboratories, they couldn't be with their students. And so I would send out emails to, professors in Harvard, to professors in the UK, and they were all so generous. And I think the pandemic, in a way, also, in academia, as there's a competition. People are, particularly in science, there's, people are trying to get ahead, but they all joined forces. And it was an incredibly collaborative process that they went through to find out how COVID destroyed this, or how it sort of gave you anosmia. But for me, I was just the recipient of this enormous intellectual generosity. So Zoom chats, phone chats, the minute we could travel, I ended up spending a week with Professor Thomas Hummel in medical school in Dresden with olfactory students, and ended up in an anatomy lab holding a human brain, which I never thought would happen to me, but was absolutely fascinating. So yeah, it really was an extraordinary experience to get up our noses, if you like.
Yeah, it sounded quite incredible, some of the things that you got to experience, like the human brain and so on.
Yeah. I have to say, I didn't think I was, I amazed myself because, the anatomy professor had a bunch of medical students and me. And I think he was he was watching me to see if I'd get squeamish, and I absolutely had to be bald-faced.
No, that sounds incredible. So I think in a minute we'll take some questions from the audience. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to write them in the Q&A section below. Is there anything else that you would like to mention before we get round to about your experiences, or those of the people that you spoke to, before we start addressing those questions?
I suppose my main thing is that if people do read the book, or if they've heard us talk about it, it would be really great if people took away the sense of just revaluing this sense, thinking about it, stopping to smell the roses, to use an awful cliche, because the truth is that with smell, you don't really know what you have until you've lost it. And I think, if you're a mother or a father with a newborn baby, that kind of smell of that newborn's head is unforgettable. When I didn't have a sense of smell, even the wet dog fur was I missed. So I think, it'd be great if people sort of thought about it and valued it. And then I would really hope that across the board medically, that at the coalface, when people go to the GP, if they've lost their sense of smell and it's not due to a clear physiological viral reason, push them to investigate further, because it can really matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So looking at the audience questions, first one that I've got, so you've obviously already mentioned a little bit about smell training and how that can kind of help people to recover from anosmia. Someone in the audience has asked whether we can more generally train ourselves to smell better and be more perceptive of the wide range of smells.
Oh, that's a really other fascinating area. I mean, if you think about sommeliers or perfumers, there are sommeliers that can tell you from a sniff what grape, not just what grape, but what part of France or what part of Italy, what kind of soil, clay soil. Yes, you can absolutely train your sense of smell. Clearly, genetically, some people are born that way. They have a sense of smell that is their most profound sort of sense, and they're naturals at it. But yes, you can. But perfumers are trained. They go to perfumery school. They are trained to identify and to be able to tell a vast variety of smells. So yes, in normal life, you can do the same thing. Just keep smelling, keep identifying. Just pay more attention, I suspect, I think would help just in itself.
Do you think that there would be kind of a general benefit for people to just kind of do the smell training in their everyday lives, even if they haven't lost their sense of smell?
I think so. And actually, I spoke to a number of physicians, including a gerontologist at one point, somebody who's dealing with old age, and keeping the sense of smell alive. We lose our sense of smell as we get older. So, if you measure the smell on the threshold and on identification, differentiation, etc., of a 65-year-old compared to a 25-year-old, you will see differences generally. But they say that one of the things that you should do as you get older is to do smell training as if you'd lost it. So every day, choose 5 smells that you like, and essential oils, put them in a pot. Charities like Absent have them, or they can tell you how to do it, and sniff and remember. And it appears to be a very helpful kind of thing to do for your brain, I guess.
Yeah, excellent. How interesting.
Use it or lose it.
Yeah. So the next question is whether there's any research that you're aware of on acute anosmia with people with sensory issues such as autism or ADHD, and how this has affected their perception of their senses or sensory overload during their anosmic period. I don't know if you're aware of any research into kind of sensory issues and anosmia.
That's really interesting. I'm not aware of any, but I can certainly find out because I've got a lot of people at my fingertips that might be able to answer. I do know that with some neuroatypical syndromes that there can be a great sensitivity to smells, and so I imagine that there would have to be some effects of loss of it. But in terms of research, I can come back to that person if they like. Absolutely no problem.
Brilliant. I can see that this person has followed up by saying that they say this as someone with autism / ADHD traits who is also hyposmic due to nasal polyps. And they say that when they get their smell back occasionally, they sometimes find some of the unpleasant smells outweigh the nice smells. That's their experience of this.
Well, that's really interesting, because one of the things that we're finding, and in fact I experienced as well, is with this regeneration, that you can get a leaning towards the bad smells over the good smells. Other people have had the opposite. So their sense of smell has come back. In fact, there was a whole thread on Facebook on the Absent page yesterday. Their sense of smell has come back, but they cannot smell bad smells, toilet smells. So some people would say it's a blessing, but actually it's very disconcerting. So totally get it.
So Sanel has asked, do you think that people are more aware of the importance of smell after COVID, or is the sense going to continue to be undervalued? Is it going to continue to be the Cinderella of the senses?
I'm an optimist, so I really hope that that it is going to have more attention. I think that the level of resource that was of intellectual firepower that was put on finding how it was lost means that it's opened up an enormous amount of other research. I think the scientific papers published in 1 year compared to the 10 years before, I think, were 3 times. So there's a lot of scientific investigation. And with that, obviously, has to come some, benefits. There's lots of work being done on measuring the effect of smell training. My sense is that it is still undervalued, but at least now we're starting to take it a little more seriously.
Yeah, and hopefully your book will also kind of help to push things in the right direction.
I really hope so.
So Nigel has asked whether humans smell pheromones through smell. An interesting question.
Well, he has asked the question that I probably can answer, but then there'll be somebody that'll come back and say, no, that's not. It's very much, well, the organ that we had that smelled pheromones in humans no longer works. We have it. I think it's called it starts with V, and I'll have to come back to him on that. Our understanding at this point in time is that the classic sex pheromone, the pheromone that is related directly to attraction, we don't have anymore. We do, however, respond to many smells in other ways. So the pheromone proper, which is I suppose the definition is slightly different, we don't think so. But it's one of those debates that is still alive out there.
Excellent, thank you. And this kind of points to the fact, as you sort of outlined in the book as well, that still a lot of things that people haven't reached a consensus on scientifically about the sense of smell. Good question. Emma has asked, are you aware of other causes of loss of smell? They say that they lost most of their sense of smell long before COVID, but unsure how to improve it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, anosmia was very well known as a result of any cold virus. You can get a cold, a bad flu, you can have nasal polyps, any form of nasal dysfunction can sometimes lead to anosmia in people. So it's absolutely, there are lots of other things that have kind of caused it. The other thing that can cause is a knock to the head, so a traumatic brain injury. But generally, the most common anosmias relate to a virus. The difference with COVID is that with other viruses and other syndromes that cause anosmia, generally it's a little less pronounced. It doesn't happen like a light turning off. COVID seemed to just literally take it out. And that's why it was so many people noticed it immediately. As you get older, your sense of smell gets less. You don't really notice it. You don't really register it. So it really, it can be many reasons. I don't know whether this person has got it back a little bit or had some recovery or...
I'm not sure. But if Emma would like to follow up on that, please feel free. Someone else has posted about their experience as well. Park says that they lost the sense of smell last July. Every now and then, my smell comes back at about 30%. It may last for a minute or a few hours, and then it's gone again, sometimes for weeks. I don't understand the recovery process. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I imagine this is a July, so last July, COVID, I would imagine, or a cold. The reality is that what this person is experiencing is absolutely normal. Most recoveries are 1 step forward, 3 steps back. You can have fluctuations. You can go for days where you can smell and then suddenly it disappears again. It is a very disheartening process, the recovery process from anosmia. But what I can say is that if you are smelling, if you are getting whiffs, then smell train and feel confident that with time and patience, it will come back. It is very disheartening, and I totally understand how they feel, but don't lose hope. July to now is not even a year, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's encouraging. I mean, you also talk in your book about kind of the links between loss of smell and then like depression and grief and things like that. So it does seem from what you've written that this can be a very kind of difficult experience for people. Can you maybe like say a little bit more about that? I know it's a bit of a kind of negative note.
No, but I think it's a really important one, because another one of the many things that I found in this book that I had no idea about is that the olfactory bulb and its size is quite directly correlated to depression. So it is fairly clear that when somebody becomes depressed, the volume of their olfactory bulb actually lessens. If you lose your sense of smell, many of us, as I did, and many other people I'm sure will feel the same or will say the same thing, you do feel like your world is black and white, it's grey, it's no longer coloured. And so there is a pull on everything. The joy of eating, of drinking, of walking, of doing the day-to-day things that we do involves smell as well. So we don't really know whether depression can trigger, or you know, the results of this smalling of the volume of the olfactory bulb is related directly, but we know we do have studies that shows it. And grief, you know, there is a real profound sense of grief when you lose a sense. I was devastated at the thought at the time that I might never experience you know, the smell of jasmine or the smell of my dog or my daughter or my husband. You know, it really is a profound sense of loss, and that is a form of grief. So I think, it's not a downer, but I think it's a reality of the loss of a sense.
Yeah, very difficult, but there is, for at least those who've lost the sense of smell through COVID, it sounds like people can be kind of optimistic about that. Yeah. I mean,
about 97% of people will recover. I mean, there's a small cohort that don't, unfortunately, but I would say to them also, just keep smell training, because the other thing, there's some really good work being done about smell training and memory. So there are, for example, Thomas Hummel, the professor in Dresden, had just started to study a young woman with no olfactory bulb, none. So therefore physiologically shouldn't be able to smell, who at the age of 22 or 23 suddenly got a sense of smell back. Now, they don't know how that's occurred, but it could be something related to memory. So in some ways we could compensate with memory if we train it. It's all very kind of esoteric at the moment, but really interesting. You know, it's brain science. So don't give up is the point.
Fascinating. You guys also followed up on that, ask how long it took you to fully recover when you lost your sense of smell.
So I lost it on March 27 at 4:00, I remember, of 2020. I think I had my first whiffs of jasmine in a neighbour's garden about 6 or 7 months later. And from there on in, look, I don't think it was normal for 2 years. I think I progressively got better and better and better, but I didn't feel like I was, at the 18 months mark, I felt relatively normal. As Robert mentioned, I still now occasionally will smell something that I know is familiar. So it might be onions frying, something that you know, but unless I have this visual source, I'm not sure. So I know the smell. I know I like the smell, for example, but I have to check, is that onions or is it bacon, or, So clearly those reconnective processes between these scaffolding cells and the amygdala in the brain, it's still happening. So yeah, just for the person who's asking, just don't lose hope, because it could be 3 years or more.
I just thought when I was listening to Paola talk about emotion and grief, that she might like to describe a moment where we were in a little town called Locorotondo in Puglia. And I think that I watched the emotion on her face as, and I'll let her explain it, but it just sort of encapsulates the grief or emotion that goes with, this thing. So I'll mute again and let her tell the story.
Oh, thank you for the prompt. I suppose, that was sort of the final part of the book. So towards the second year mark, we're in this little town in southern Italy, in the boot of Italy, in the heel, and it was a festival, a religious procession. And I'm Italian, I'm not particularly religious, but my grandmother was very Catholic, and the smells of frankincense and those kind of very mass-like smells, this procession went past me, and this smell that reminded me of my grandmother must have hit my nose. And I literally, I didn't really have any visual stimulus at that point, because I wasn't sure what was happening. But I was sobbing from this kind of profound memory of having both smell and being transported right back, to my grandmother. And I suppose that's the other thing that we didn't really touch on, and I guess we're getting close to time, but smell is the only sense that bypasses the kind of rational part of the brain. So when a smell goes into your nose, it hits the amygdala, which is what they call the reptilian part. It's the first part of the brain that evolved in evolutionary terms, and it's the most primitive part of our response and governs a number of other things that we don't have control over. But it's also the center for the processing of memory and emotion. And so that's why, there's Marcel Proust's very famous Madeleine moment, and where most of us, if you ask anyone in the audience, they will remember a smell that transports them right back to their grandma or their long-lost lover or their child's birth or whatever. It's a really, really intense and powerful moment. So thank you for reminding me, Robert.
Absolutely. I've got some more questions. Hopefully we have just about enough time to take them both. So I'll start with Nigel. So Nigel asks whether you went off your food and lost weight during your anosmic period.
Unfortunately not. Funnily enough, people went two ways. People either went off their food and lost a lot of weight. And unfortunately for me, I did the other, which was I was desperately seeking some kind of pleasure out of my food. And unfortunately, crunchy, salty things or sweet things they were the things I could taste because my tongue could do that. So no, I didn't lose weight. And I remember a long period where I couldn't taste gin, but I could taste Campari. So I would put Campari because it's bitter, obviously. So the Campari went into the gin, and there was a change in my drinking habits. All that settled as well.
So I think we've just got time for questions, Sarah. Sorry if we're not going to get to your other question. Sarah asks, what are your next steps? Are you going to write another book, different subject, different project entirely, or are you going to take a break?
Well, Robert's just got a new book coming out. He's just ghosted an English cricketer, and that's coming out in the next few weeks, and it's called Legacy. And when I embarked on this project, I had also embarked on a PhD in Department of English. And it was a book about a perfumer, would you believe, in Bourbon, Naples, 18th, 19th century Naples. So I lost my sense of smell as I was researching a 19th century perfumer. But in the meantime, I finished that book, and PhD is finished, and my viva is on Monday. Yeah, so hopefully that'll find a publisher. Who knows? Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. So we're just about out of time, but I've got a couple of things to kind of go through just before we close. So first and most importantly, I just want to thank you both, Paola and Robert, so much for being here and for telling us about your kind of journey into the world of the sense of smell and the loss of the sense of smell. It was really, really interesting talking to you, and I really enjoyed your book as well. And finally, if you would like to purchase a copy of Paola and Robert's book, On the Scent will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. For more information on book sales, you can see the festival website, or you can head direct to foxlanebooks.co.uk/festival-of-ideas. So that closes our session today. Thank you so much again. And thank you all for your really interesting questions as well.
Thank you so much for having us. We loved it. Thank you, Becky.